Why does this 300-kilometer train journey between two major cities take up to a day to travel? The cities are Ndola and Lusaka, Zambia's economic hub and the country's capital, connected by a single railway line operated by Zambia Railways. The train runs once a week. It leaves on Fridays and is meant to take 12 and a half hours on a good day. Now, before you assume this is a budget operation cutting corners to make rail affordable, the bus covers the same route in 5 hours at only a slightly higher price point. So the train isn't slow because it's cheap, it's just slow. Here's the number that puts it into perspective. 12 and a half hours across 291 kilometers to be exact works out to an average speed of 23 kilometers per hour. That's 2 kilometers per hour faster than Sebastian Sauer's average pace at the London Marathon. Now, this video isn't really about one train or one country. It's about a continent whose rail infrastructure was built with zero interest in its economic future. Let's start with the continent-wide picture because the numbers are genuinely hard to absorb. Africa is the second largest continent on Earth by both area and population, yet it only accounts for approximately 2% of global rail freight. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, has around 4,000 kilometers of rail. The UK, a country 4 times smaller, has almost 4 times the rail network, and Germany's network is 3 times larger than the whole of West Africa's. That's not a development gap or a funding shortfall you can fix in a national budget. It is a fundamentally different category of infrastructure altogether. Take a moment to look at this map. What you're seeing isn't a network in the way the word describes. What you're seeing is a collection of lines, each running from the coast towards the interior, reaching a mine or a resource site and stopping. This map isn't an accident. It is a design that works exactly as intended, and understanding that design is the key to understanding everything else in this video. Here's the foundational fact of African rail. Almost none of it was built to move Africans or African goods between cities. When colonial powers constructed railways across Africa, the engineering brief was simple: extraction. Whatever the territory produced, the railway existed to evacuate it to a port. Once the resource was on a ship, the railway had done its job. Connecting Nairobi to Kampala, for example, didn't serve that purpose, so the railways either weren't built or were built decades later as afterthoughts. This is why the rail map looks the way it does. It's the physical imprint of a system designed to benefit elsewhere. But the extraction design isn't even the deepest structural problem. There's something more basic, more mechanical. The tracks simply don't fit each other. Across Africa today, there are at least 6 rail gauges in use, 6 different widths between the rails. A train built for one gauge size can't run on another. This isn't a technical problem waiting for a technical solution. It is the direct consequence of each colonial power building railways to their own domestic specification. The British built one way, the French built another, the Belgians another. And decades after independence, the railways have stayed a ghost of a system designed by people who are never planning to stay. Nowhere on the continent makes this clearer than the Copperbelt. The Copperbelt is a mineral-rich region just south of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It holds some of the largest copper and cobalt reserves on Earth. The copper and cobalt in your iPhone, there's a massive chance it came from there. But getting it out is an exercise in a logistical crisis. And this leads me to TAZARA. In 1970, Zambia had a problem. Zambia is landlocked, and all of its existing rail corridors to the coast ran through Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, and Portuguese Mozambique. For a newly independent Zambia pushing African liberation movements, using those routes wasn't viable. The sensible coastal access was through Tanzania. So the two countries asked for help. They asked the West and the World Bank. Both said the project made no commercial sense, so they went to China. And China said yes. Between 1970 and 1975, roughly 50,000 Chinese and local workers built the railway through some of the most challenging terrain in Africa. It was, at the time, the largest Chinese foreign aid project in history. It was called TAZARA, the Tanzania-Zambia Railway Authority. It was a genuine feat of engineering, a symbol of Pan-Africanism, but by 2023, it was only carrying around 6% of its designated freight capacity. The collapse has been slow and structural. Maintenance funds have dried up and locomotives have deteriorated. Governments with competing priorities have simply sidelined the railway. A truck from the Copperbelt to Durban takes about a week. The TAZARA train to Dar es Salaam, a shorter route, can take up to 2 months. And this matters in ways that compound daily. Every day, a ton of copper sits waiting behind a broken locomotive or in a yard with no power. Across thousands of tons over weeks of delays, it becomes a structural drain on the industry the national economy relies on. Now, none of these issues are being ignored. Over the past 2 decades, significant rail investment has come to Africa. The most visible wave has been Chinese-built standard gauge railways in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, to name a few. These are modern railways built to global specifications, and in some cases, they work quite well. So why hasn't this solved the problem? Because each of these lines was built in isolation. They were financed separately, operated separately, and built to standard gauge, which is not the gauge of the colonial era lines. There's currently no plan to connect these new lines to each other, let alone to harmonize them with the older gauge systems across the continent. And the financing has created its own complications. Several of these railways were built under Chinese loan agreement with repayment structures that have since become a sticking point politically. The infrastructure is transformative, but the debt is real. The most significant development for TAZARA is what happened in 2025. China, Tanzania, and Zambia signed an agreement to rehabilitate the line, handing management to a Chinese firm for 30 years. The same country that built the railway in the 1970s has been called back to fix it 50 years later. That's not a criticism, but it is a striking illustration of where Africa's rail story currently sits, not at the beginning, not at the end, but somewhere in a long, complicated middle. So back to where we started. A 300-kilometer journey between 2 major cities takes a day because the train moves at the speed of a bicycle and runs once a week. Because the railway was built to serve a different purpose than connecting cities. Because the TAZARA corridor, built with Chinese labor and capital as a statement of African sovereignty, is now being rebuilt by China because 50 years wasn't enough time to maintain it. And the minerals that can't go by rail, they go by truck. Thousands of trucks crawling out of the Copperbelt carrying billions of dollars in minerals heading for the coast, and almost all of them pass through the same border crossing. It is, by some measures, the most economically important traffic jam on Earth. It's called Kasumbalesa, one of the world's most complicated border crossings. Come back for that one. Thanks for watching.